Okay, now we are opening our proceedings with the first session. The first session of our conference, titled Ingredients. We're going to have two sessions with Daniel Belder, University of Toronto, and Jeff Newman, also University of Toronto, on recipes, substitution, and the age of mechanical reproduction. And then Sasha Gora, Universität Augsburg, on tongues and their mothers, ingredients, and their understudies. Chairing this session is Michelle King, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she specializes in modern Chinese food and gender history. She is the author of Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, Fu Pei Mei and the Making of Modern Chinese Food, W.W. Norton 24, award-winning book, which actually was named one of the best books of 2024 by the New York Times, National Public Radio, and Savoir magazine. She is also the co-editor of Modern Chinese Foodways for MIT Press 2025, and editor of Culinary Nationalism in Asia, Bloomsbury 2019. Not part of this bio, but she's also visiting professor at UNISG Pollenzo, master class on Chinese, global Chinese foodways. And at this point, I let you lead the session. Yes, our speakers, each speaker throughout the conference has 20 minutes for the presentation, and for this first part of the conference, this session has 30 minutes for questions from the audience. We encourage Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone, to this first session. It's my great pleasure to chair the session. I'm going to introduce our first two speakers, and then when we have our next speaker, I will introduce the third speaker. And so, as Simone said, each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for your questions. And great. So this morning, our first two speakers are Dan Bender and Jeff Newman. Dan is the Canada Research Chair in Food and Culture and Professor of Food Studies at the University of Toronto in the Culinaria Research Centre and in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences. He's the author, most recently, of Food Adventurers, How Around the World Travel Changed the Way We Eat, which in my recent travels to Taipei, I just saw in Chinese translation, so that was very exciting. He's also the co-editor with Simone of Food Mobility's Making World Cuisines. He's the current president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society and a member of the editorial collective of Gastronomica. Jeff Newman is the college librarian at New College at the University of Toronto. His recent research interests include exploring food scholarship-related research methodologies and information literacy practices, and also on the intersections of race, gender, diversity, and bias in large language model systems. So I will give you guys a wave when there's about 2 minutes left.
Great. Well, we're delighted to talk to you guys for the next hour and a half. Thank you on behalf of both of us to Simone, to all of you for being here. A special welcome to the students starting their UNISG journey. It can only get better from here. So the project that we're working on is spaghetti with bacon and egg sauce. That word, that name, spaghetti with bacon and egg sauce, is anything that turns smoked pork and chicken eggs into a condiment for noodles. But spaghetti alla carbonara evokes something about cuisine, a place of origin, a story caught betwixt North America and Europe, and a familiar taste. It has a history. And that brings us to our key goals, really, for this morning's session. Ingredients. What do we use, not use, and crucially, what does it mean to substitute, given that all of us do it whenever we cook? We use this to raise questions about the ingrained goal of recipes towards reproducibility. Raising these questions allows us to make two connections. First, theoretically, to Walter Benjamin, and secondly, to the role of mechanical reproduction in culinary arts and capitalism. So what happens when we don't follow the rules of the recipe? Can the act of substitution be a political act? Can it be an ecological act? Our chapter here for this future collection uses this collection, The Art of Spaghetti Cookery, by Myra Waldo, one of the most prolific of the post-war American authors. We can get into her biography in discussion. And we're specifically interested in this specific recipe, spaghetti with bacon and egg sauce, or spaghetti alla carbonara. We're going to cook, we're going to taste, we're going to feed our families, we're going to apologize to our families, and we're going to consider the place where both Waldo and we, in cooking, substituted. Some key points. Recipes, printed, then digitized, are a chapter in the history of capitalism. Second, food recipes are both symptomatic of a larger impulse for mechanical reproduction and scientific management, and unique insofar as they are both commodities and a form of labor discipline. In its essence, the recipe, whether for the production of steel rails or pastry, promises mechanical reproduction. A recipe has a communicative intent that is temporal. It is not for now, it is for the future, to facilitate recreation, reproduction. Producing a food recipe is a human act that is carried out by the cook, the baker, the hobbyist, the worker. But the idea of reproducibility via tools, techniques, and standards is mechanical. And the act of following a recipe is a moment where the human intersects with the outputs and demands of a capitalist drive of desire, placelessness, mechanization, and standardization. Try it that way, or not, or that, or that. Just figure it out. There we go. So, Walter Benjamin, right, and his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Recipes depend on the allure of reproducibility, and through the technologies of publishing on paper and digitally, and the innovation of mass marketing, they entered the age of mechanical reproduction. Thus, Walter Benjamin cooking. The emergence of, thank you, Rosie, I appreciate the chuckle there. The emergence of the modern recipe intersects with the history traced in Benjamin's essay, and he considers in his essay how the modern visual and sonic technologies transformed cultural artifacts. He wrote about Chaplin. We ask about spaghetti carbonara. What did mechanical reproduction mean for taste? Applying his framework, one drawn from the visual and fine arts, to taste through reproduction, dissemination, and mass cookery of recipes, can highlight the sensory limitations of the capitalist impulse for standardization, especially if ingredients travel at different speeds than food knowledge. The idea of recipes is synonymous with extended networks of trade. We know that. But recipes are themselves products of industrial and cultural revolutions. They're printed. They are sold. But more than anything, they insist upon accumulation. You must acquire the ingredients. In this way, they initiate a chain of need, of desire, and therefore commodification. Recipes, therefore, can help us determine the misuse of nature and technologically run counter to the very limits of how animals and plants live and mature. The recipe for carbonara, of course, requires eggs, oblivious to the hen. And there are other recipes in her book demand vegetables, regardless of season, as we will talk through. Here's the paradox, then. The paradox of continued technological development of recipes through artificial intelligence and digitalization means an ecological crisis of infinite recipes and finite foods. However successful capitalism might be in the mechanical reproduction of the visual and sonic arts, we argue that it fails with the culinary because of the prevalence of substitution. Where there are recipes, there is always substitution. Substitution troubles the goal of the modern recipe and, indeed, the goal of mass reproduction. Capitalism might just be weakest at its most proximate of senses.
So, Fanny Farmer offers us this nature of measuring implements, transforming the genre of still life into the recipe precursor, the measuring implements. It offers the still life of nature, then of nature measured, mobilized, and quantified. Recipes are modern capitalism. The same urge towards standardization from the 19th century onwards, measurements formed a common language. Ingredients were graded and sized, lengths and volumes agreed upon, and applied across the venues of capitalism, from factory to kitchen to farm. It was essential to the mobility of commodities, including food, rendering an amount and a quantity legible, legal, and trustworthy, even across global spaces where commercial relationships of familiarity and personal trust were impossible. Measurements created a vocabulary that enabled reproducibility, even when ecology produces variability. And measurements created a language where anonymous transmission of recipes and their mechanical reproductions could move through space and time. But it is a fiction that nature can be so thoroughly regularized. This paradox is important as we advance here an ecological reading of substitution alongside an engagement with both Marx and Benjamin. Oh, sorry, advance too quickly. So printing and the digital mechanically reproduce an author or compiler's recipes for readers, cooks, across time, distances, climates, and culinary infrastructures. And then once in the kitchen, they promise the cooking and reproducibility of a recipe. Print became a technology of taste, and so too has the digital, but in fundamentally different ways with new sensory potentials. Importantly, this reproduction manufactures desire, but there's an illogic here. The illogic of standardization ends in recipes and kilograms and Scoville units, jumbo eggs, 00 flour, and brands, as if these accurately are reproducible, but with an environmental impact. The eggs in Myra Waldo's recipes impose the needs of the recipe upon the abilities of the chicken. Standardization is an agro-industrialist, capitalist imaginary ideal that cannot be fully realized. It is a fiction that nature can be thoroughly regularized. In certain ingredients, the goal of standardization has been fairly successful, such as wheat, soy sauce, or MSG, but in other ingredients, despite industrial efforts to standardize the size and quality levels of bananas, pineapples, or beef, we confront the reality of rot, ripening, mutation, individual lives, climate, and the season. And as much as recipes try to standardize, we subvert those standardizations, and the reasons we subvert them are many. And here we are proposing an outline of a taxonomy. And here we're thinking of the various ways that we decide to substitute and the various reasons we decide to substitute. And at this point, there is a list. And we will share the There was supposed to be a QR code on our slide that didn't make it over, so we will share this later in the hopes that we can all collaborate upon this. We would like to think about the relationship between the reasons we substitute. So we've put together a Padlet with different ideas of why and when we choose to make substitutions in our recipes. And hoping that this can become a collaborative act, there is not a QR code on the screen. My apologies, we will figure out a way to circulate this so that we can make this more of a communal act. Okay, I will turn it back over to you.
So, give me
No.
that. The recipe form is the capitalist impulse, and we shouldn't think about recipes as something that exists purely in the realm of the culinary. The urge for reproduction solidified as recipes took the familiar form of measured ingredients followed by step-by-step instructions. It joined the precision of measurements that underpins all mass production and reproduction, not simply artistic or culinary. Over the course of the 19th into the 20th centuries, the industrial manufacture of, for example, steel for railroads was different from the recipes, the measurements, distinct from those for, say, the production of steel plating for ships. If we're to understand the cultural significance of the culinary recipe, we must therefore question distinctions between manufacture, cookery, and the arts. Scientific management and scientific cookery are part of the same wielding of scientific logic to seize management power from workers. This is my new favorite historical source. It's a subgenre of the Universal Recipe Encyclopedia, and it was called Mackenzie's 10,000 Recipes, or Recipes, in all the useful and domestic arts. It dates from 1867, went through multiple publications, and it included recipes for everything from agriculture to metallurgy to pastry. Pound cake, the recipe here. Take 1 pound of butter and so on. But later on in the day, want to make silver ore? You take the assay quantity of the ore, finely powdered, and roast it well in a proper degree of heat. And we're going to be able to do this later in the UNISG kitchen, right? We're going to make some silver ore. So thinking about these together, we get to go to the next slide. Jeff, how do we move to the next slide? Scroll down. Okay. There we go. Waldo inherited a practice all the way from the famous Fanny Farmer, seen at the top in her Boston Cooking School cookbook, of specific measurements followed by physical movements that the cook must follow in combining ingredients to final service. She told you how to move your hand to mix bread, to cut flour, and the like. We understand this combination of physical direction and ingredient measurements as labor management. Indeed, down the road in the factory, contemporaneous management also sought to discipline the workers' movements to produce a standardized product. Just 15 years after Farmer published her Boston Cooking School cookbook, we see a remarkably similarly bourgeois-looking Frederick Winslow Taylor, as he compiled his studies of industrial labor management, introducing his idea of scientific management. The manager's task, he argued, was to seize what he called traditional knowledge of factory workers by dividing an artisan's gestures into repetitive motions that could be taught to the unskilled. And my skills do not extend to PowerPoint, clearly.
It's a repetitive gesture, Dan.
It's a repetitive gesture.
So neither Fanny Farmer nor Myra Waldo wrote their recipes. Really, they took others and they substituted. And here's just a gesture of some of the kinds of substitutions we can identify in Fanny Farmer's implementation in Myra Waldo's implementation of this recipe, and try to keep track of the movements as the ingredients shift going through time.
See, it's not easy.
But I did it. So where Farmer began with her still life of measuring spoon, Waldo endorsed specific measuring instruments, those made by the company Pyrex. And the animations in our slides have completely broken. Behind this image is an image of Myra Waldo feeding her husband. And so we see the female tourist retains the role of feeding her husband, and in dialogue with the Pyrex endorsement, she staged the photo for an Italian news magazine, caught here in the act of extracting recipes. And this brings us to the question of reproduction, and the problematic question of whether what a recipe has what Benjamin called an aura. There's a lot at stake in this question, not only for how we, in the Relish project, think about recipe visualizations, but also about the very portability of the gendered Marxist critique Benjamin offered of the visual and sonic and the culinary arts. Benjamin argued that mechanical reproduction diminishes the aura of an artwork, its unique presence in time and space. Instead, he argued, mechanical reproduction holds out the possibility of democratizing art as a subject of mass consumption. But given the gendered meanings attached to home cooking, is there the same aura attached to the culinary arts that there is the fine arts? Through ritual, tradition, and religion? Benjamin does not address the question of whether crafts in general or culinary art specifically gain and can therefore lose the aura. For the same gendered reason that Benjamin cannot recognize taste objects as art, they evade his chronology and of shedding of aura. So where Benjamin conceives of the work of art as something having a unique existence that determines the history to which it was subject through the time of its existence, a dish is consumed. And if anything remains, it decomposes. And with that exception of all but the most processed foods, it is often gone in less time than it took to prepare.
We had some beautiful animations that we'll move through, but we really did. But just to point out again that this recipe moved, her recipe moved, it was recommodified. Here it appears again in the London Observer, and we note the idea that the cookbook, that the writing in the Observer, that a cookbook is really a textbook written very often by amateurs for amateurs. We raise this question of the use of the word amateur as an evocation of the very de-skilling of the recipe. To move forward a little bit in the interest of time. Is it this one? Yes. Recipes are ecological acts. The fact that Waldo names a recipe is both a recognition of the goal of mechanical reproduction and that cooks can never achieve it. We name a recipe because we can never really cook it. And we turn briefly to the chronology here. Benjamin wrote between wars, anticipating the intensification of art forms, and Waldo wrote after it, during that great acceleration that included the rise of global tourism, mass consumption of newly commodified ingredients, and the mobilization of a vast range of natural products. And you see here Myra Waldo in an ad for American Frankfurters, shilling, if you will, for that great acceleration. As measurements are disaggregated from natural variabilities, so too are recipes disconnected from ecological processes of ripening, weather, seasonal change. Thus, even in colder months, we turn to this recipe where Myra Waldo calls for everything from tomatoes to zucchini. I think we need to move through it because of time here, Jeff.
Yep, no problem.
And because they don't work.
And because the animations don't work. So this recipe, we identified some fresh ingredients, zucchini, green peppers, tomatoes, basil, capers, black olives. And what we've done here is mapped out their growing season in the city of Toronto, where we are from. So these are late summer, early fall ingredients. The capers and olives don't grow there. We have to get them from somewhere else. They are preserved through different processes. But this is when these are available. So if we set out to cook using tomatoes in this season, they are coming very locally from around the Toronto area. About 100 to 300 kilometers, those tomatoes will travel to be in our cook pots. But if we try to cook these in the winter, suddenly these ingredients aren't coming from the local surrounding farmlands. They're coming from Mexico, California, Guatemala, Morocco. I was surprised to discover Moldova is a major supplier of tomatoes to us in the winter, and Spain. And so these are coming globally to feed us here, and we're substituting the local varietal for what is available internationally through capitalist supply chains. And so everything is a substitution because of what is available. And the recipe doesn't give us the seasonality. It always presents it as a now and a present. And I will turn
So just one word of summing up as this advertisement for Myra Waldo's cookbook and a later edition of the Boston Cooking School cookbook. Yes, you a gourmet chef for only $4. And Myra Waldo fondling some cheese in an Italian grocery store that may be in New York, it may be in Italy. We raised this question of substitution so early on in this workshop to ask questions about how we cook and to raise the question of whether through substitution and through its visualization that we can suggest these ideas of mechanical reproduction, to leave the recipe in the world of the visual, to decide at different times of the year, different places, to not cook. The act of mechanical reproduction. So we'll leave it there.
Okay, so our next speaker is Sasha Gora, who is an essayist and cultural historian who writes about food, the environment, and contemporary art. Based at the University of Augsburg in Bavaria, Germany, she is the project director and principal investigator of the Off the Menu, Appetites, Culture, and Environment Research Group. Her first book, Culinary Claims, Indigenous Restaurant Politics in Canada, was published by the University of Toronto just this year in March. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Michelle. A huge thank you to Claudia and to Simona for organizing this really inspiring already workshop and the invitation for being here. And thank you to everyone who is here as well. Also to Dan and Jeff, because in many ways I am going to be taking kind of the torch from you in terms of thinking about recipes and the politics of substitutions. I'm also really excited to be on the ingredients panel. This feels maybe I could call it a petty win in some ways. So 6 years ago, I submitted my doctoral dissertation, and it had 3 parts. And part 1, I titled Land. Part 2, I titled Restaurants. And part 3, I titled Ingredients. And in part 3, I focused on 3 animal-human case studies. So I was looking at beaver, seal, and salmon. And my doctoral supervisor, Christophe Mao, who is an environmental historian, he really tested me on this. He's like, why did you call this ingredients and not animals? And the case that I was trying to make is that I was studying them specifically in a food context. And so the fact that I'm on this panel titled Ingredients feels very much like a sign that I'm in the right place. But I also want to mention this because I think it's important in terms of some of the tensions between different fields of study and how we approach recipes. So the other thing I want to say before I begin is this is more kind of a point that I will point out to, and then maybe we can come back to it during the discussion is when I was reading the papers, similar to what Dan was saying yesterday, the more I thought about recipes, the more uncertain I was in terms of what they are and how I understand them, and I take them for granted, which I think is a very positive thing. But I also started to really think specifically about the relationship between text and image, between illustrations and recipes, and between photography and now video with recipes. And so what's exciting about this workshop is we're going to hear talks from very different periods and different geographies, and there's a lot of examples before photography was invented, before photography became affordable, and the reproduction of images. But I do want to put this out there in terms of what happens if we have an illustration, what happens if we have a photograph. Is that part of the recipe? Is it a paratext? Does it change how people interact with it? Does it create different expectations? So with that in mind, I am serving you one single image on 3 different slides. So it will keep you company while I'm sharing my text, but also something to think about with what am I sharing and what does this image add or perhaps take away from it. So my paper is titled Tongues and Their Mothers, Ingredients and Their Understudies. And I start by revisiting a recipe that the New York Times published in 2013 that some of you might remember. And the recipe was for green pea guacamole. So this was adapted from a restaurant in Manhattan. And don't worry, there were still avocados in the guacamole. But in addition to them, as the name gives away, there were also sweet peas. However, the internet completely lost its mind. So this was branded the Peagate by some, the pea guacamole controversy by others. And the rest of the ingredients in this recipe were very much business as usual, and yet the presence of peas sparked the question whether or not it could even be called guacamole. And guacamole is a natural word meaning avocado sauce. So I'm really interested in this reaction and how it leads to this question of what does this reaction reveal about the politics of 1, naming recipes, and 2, altering them? So how elastic is a recipe, and when does it stop being one dish and instead turn into another dish? And I like this example for another reason, which is that today, avocados have very much become shorthand for drought, deforestation, distance, which is to say concerns about culinary sustainability. And in an ironic twist, a restaurant in the city that I live in, Munich, which prides itself on its local sourcing, which is called Das Culinariat, on their breakfast menu, they offer what they call a no avocado Brot. And so there are no avocados on this bread, but instead they use peas. So this introduces how menus and recipes are always entangled with ecosystems that host the flora and fauna that they taxonomize as edible. And it also points to how recipes archive appetites that once were, which is what I've been calling the ghosts of appetites past. So thinking about how they are gone and yet still very much present. So with my talk, my title is a recipe in some ways in the sense that it's a guide. It offers direction. So I began reflecting on first, tongues and their mothers, and second, on ingredients and their understudies. So I outline how I think about recipes, and then I consider an earlier example of a dish that I compare to no avocado pot, which is mock turtle soup and its relationship to turtle soup. So I'm doing this to reflect on the role that language and substitutions play in recipes. So long before I knew that there was this wonderful field called food studies, I wanted to be an art historian and a curator. And more specifically, I wanted to be a curator named Maria Lind. And I followed her around a little bit, taking different classes that she offered. And in one of them, I remember how she shared with the students her favorite way to start an art essay. So she told us to describe the artwork as if you were writing a recipe. List the ingredients, she coached us. So a couple of years later, I was assigned to write a text about an artist for a gallery in Montreal, and I decided to follow her instructions, and this is what I wrote. And like I said, this is years before I knew about food studies. If you were to write a recipe for Patrick Berubet's practice, the ingredients would range from the ordinary to the slightly grotesque: wood, bird food, and fluorescent lights, glass, pedestals, and lint rollers, piles of National Geographic, cigarettes, and taxidermy. So we can question whether or not this is a recipe, but in terms of a piece of writing, I'm curious about, why does this work? Why is this a formula that Maria Lynn suggested? And I wonder if it's perhaps because it pairs the specific with the intimate, and because it details the whole by considering its parts. So a few years ago, I was working on a different essay, and this one was about cookbooks by artists. And in this essay, I was really looking at how artists use the recipe as an artistic medium. And for this, I started by thinking about how recipes are often a genre of translation. Cooking's mother tongue is a physical one, and recipes translate these acts into words. So translation is also a theme I think we'll be talking about a lot because it came up in many of the papers. So because recipes are written in second person, they require you to follow, to trust, but often also to disobey, to figure out things on your own when something's not available. And so because of this, for some years, I've been thinking about how recipe is a kind of score. It's composed to be repeated, rehearsed, and performed again and again and again. So what happens if we think of a recipe not as a set of instructions to follow, but as a script or score to interpret or rehearse? And how a score scripts multiple outcomes, choreographing the possibility of a plurality of performances. Last month, Samin Nosrat published a new cookbook. Some of you might already have it. And she followed up her 2017 bestseller, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Mastering the Elements of Cooking, with this new book called Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love. And the cookbook begins with a confession. Nosrat hates recipes. So in a section titled The Problem with Recipes, she writes, quote, "I'd be lying if I didn't admit that at times it feels like a betrayal to assemble a book of recipes after writing a manifesto designed to free cooks from relying on them. For long as I've been cooking, I've had a complicated relationship with recipes. I could never escape the feeling that each was an attempt to capture, quantify, and define the ineffable." End quote. So she confesses this, but still recognizes the role that recipes play in sharing food, in sharing knowledge, in sharing stories and experiences. So she offers instead her approach, writing, quote, "I've always thought that a cook's relationship to a written recipe is akin to the way a musician relates to notes on a page." So by way of a conclusion in this section, she thinks of recipes not as rigid prescriptions, but as rituals that promise transformation. So in tune with this, because the same ingredient is never the same, it's always different. The recipe is, to quote the writer Rebecca May Johnson, a method for seeking. A recipe can expand to encompass space for the cook to refuse it, to make room for one's own appetite, and to make it and remake it again and again. But this comes back to this question of, when does it stop being one recipe and start becoming another? I'm also interested in the role that time plays here. So recipes record a before and predict an after. They draw on past actions to anticipate future appetites. So here I'm thinking with the literary scholar Kyla Wazana Tompkins and how she underlines how a recipe opens a window into the daily intertwining of past, present, and future. And this is what she calls the mundane present tense of the recipe. So here, the imperative as tense and as mood comes into play, implying an I in concert with a you. Recipes are also maps, as we heard in the first paper, and compasses. They connect and navigate different sites and scales. But to repeat this question that came up already, what happens when ingredients change or when they're not available? So thinking with another literary scholar, Keja Valens, she describes cookbooks as, quote, being kept alive by substitution, modification, and recreation. And it seems like the same would apply to recipes. To keep a recipe alive, you must keep repeating it. But if one of the ingredients disappears or is endangered, what happens? So to give one example that perhaps not is an answer to this question, but maybe expands the question or gives us a different entry point, I want to quickly summarize the history of turtle soup. In the 18th century, turtle soup became a culinary star. Made with tropical and subtropical green sea turtle, it gained the reputation as a key dish of grand English cuisine. So London dining clubs peddled turtles, which were shipped live in bespoke tanks from Caribbean waters. And as the historian Meibo Ching describes, turtle feasts became an object of quasi-patriotic luxury and excitement for communal consumption among elites. But another historian, Sharika Crawford, points out that although it became synonymous with British fare, or perhaps because of this, few remembered the Nicaraguan, or better yet, transnational origins. So indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, such as the Miskito, had long eaten turtles, a history that recipes leave out. Hannah Glass debuted her best-selling The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy in 1747 and included a turtle soup recipe in its fourth edition in 1751, which is believed to be the first published in a cookbook. But Glass doesn't call it soup. Instead, she calls it dressing turtle the West Indian way. And the recipe begins the night before you intend to make it. Take the turtle out of the water and lay it on its back, Glass instructs. The next morning, I'm going to tell you, but I have to prepare for it because it's very light on the punctuation. So the next morning, and as a disclaimer, it is kind of graphic. The next morning, you quote, cut its head off and hang it up by its hind fins for it to bleed till the blood is all out. Then cut the callipee, which is the belly, round and raise it up. Cut as much meat to it as you can. Throw it into spring water with a little salt. Cut the fins off and scald them with the head. Take off all the scales, cut all the white meat out, and throw it into the spring water and salt. The guts and lungs must be cut out. Wash the lungs very clean from the blood, then take the guts and maw and slit them open. Wash them very clean and put them on to boil in a large pot of water and boil them till they are tender. Then take off the inside skin and cut them in pieces of 2 or 3 inches long. Have ready a good veal broth, end quote. So the recipe, as you can hear, requires not only chopping and boiling, but also actively killing. But the veal broth here is very important. It's of significance. And this is because the word mock separates a soup with turtle from one without. So Glass published a recipe for mock turtle soup in the 6th edition of her book in 1758. And this one blends herbs and spices and sherry with a calf's head, which was much cheaper to mimic a turtle's flavor and gelatinous texture. However, calf's head soup was already a soup. So to call it not what it was, but to highlight what it wasn't, highlights how, one, turtle soup became popular, but also, two, the role of names and how one dish defines another. So another way that I can phrase this is how names reveal the dishes that we think other dishes with. So the recipes that we think other recipes with. By the late 1800s, there were tins of turtle fins, jars and cans of turtle soup, and bottles of turtle meat extract, which is to say, to make turtle soup, you no longer had to kill the turtle. But the problem was that the green turtles could not keep up with this demand. And in 1905, a newspaper broke the bad news that there was not a single live turtle in London. And this caused a reporter to worry if aldermen would have no option but to eat mock turtle soup. So this cast mock turtle soup very clearly as an understudy the elite would only call on in dire circumstances. In 1973, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora classified green sea turtles as endangered. So recipes record appetites past. There have been and continue to be other types of turtle soup. For example, in the US, farmed alligator snapping turtle is now the soup's main ingredient after American appetites threaten the terrapin with extinction. In China and Singapore, recipes call for Chinese soft-shell turtles, but this species is now also vulnerable. So we can think about how this is a food today and a culinary ghost potentially tomorrow. But extinction is not so straightforward. And the historian Dolly Jorgensen makes the case that extinction is not a fixed state. She recognizes that nominally it's the end of the line, but it also carries the potential to be undone. So extinct species sit in a transitional liminal space, mostly dead, but potentially alive. And I'm arguing that recipes capture these complexities and contradictions. Because they occupy the eternal present, the relationship is not exclusive to the past, and so even a historical recipe for a dish that once was carries the potential to still be followed and to be made again. So the image that has been accompanying us is from a project that is done by Cooking Sections. And Cooking Sections is an artistic duo based in London, consisting of Daniel Fernandez Pascal and Alain Schwabe. So they've been collaborating as Cooking Sections since 2013, and in 2015, they launched a project which is called Climivore, and Climivore studies how people should eat as seasons change. In 2020, they published a book called Salmon, a Red Herring, and this was also the title of an exhibition that they had at Tate Britain in 2021 when they were nominated for the Turner Prize. And so as part of their practice, they have gotten 20 cultural institutions to remove farm salmon from their menus. And so this is a picture of what they call back-to-earth tomatoes on toast. So it was from a project that they did at the Serpentine a couple of years ago, but once again, it's an example of something not being there defining it. So instead of having salmon on toast, we have tomatoes on toast. And in 2022, I participated in a residency that they had previously been part of called The Politics of Food at Delphina Foundation in London, the city that popularized turtle. And thinking about these substitutions, thinking about ghosts, thinking about the eternal present of recipes, I created what I called a mock turtle soup. So I mourn the ghosts of these recipes past in tandem with their potential futures. So after calf's head had replaced green turtle, I replaced it with seitan. I followed some recipes and dissipated others, making and unmaking turtle as a genre of soup. Thank you.
Time for questions and comments. You have a question?
I'll go first. So my question and my comment maybe is for Jeff and Daniel. Thank you so much. I've been thinking about this idea of substitution because a few years ago I found the first recipe cookbook published in Ecuador. Is from 1860, so yeah, it's somehow old, even though Ecuador was established as a republica in 1830. So, you know, there's this time gap. However, it is a very interesting cookbook because the recipes are actually French recipes with Ecuadorian ingredients. So here you found, I think, something else, a political act, because this cookbook is kind of like establishing some sort of new identity of who should or how should Ecuadorians cook, right? Not our traditional recipes, but these adapted French recipes through this substitution. So I have been thinking about how this is a political act where substitution is kind of establishing our identity as Ecuadorians. And yeah, I was wondering if you would like to say something about this. Thank you.
Gosh, so much. I gotta press this. Did I press it? No. Yes. There we go. Now you can hear me. Everything I just said was brilliant, but you didn't hear it. So I really, your point about the political acts is really important. And it's also useful to think about a cookbook as a different political act than the recipe therein as different kinds of politics. And there's a fascinating way in which we're playing with, right? Like the idea of the political act of nation making through consumption of its ingredients, which, like, I think that that's everywhere in the idea of cookbooks, right? Including, of course, Artusi, right? But I think that part of what all of us, and not to speak for you, Sasha, but as I read Sasha's paper, is this idea of also using up of national and indeed also imperial ingredients. But also there's a question of resistance there, right? And there's a deliberate substitution on the part of the author of that book, carrying on a certain language of prestige, of class, of, you know, what Carlo Pastrini was talking about earlier. But there's also something about what happens if you don't cook that recipe. I'm really interested in the idea of not cooking recipes. And you know, the final kind of substitution of just not doing it at all. And does that, if you don't cook that recipe, if you don't buy the cookbook, are you refusing the nation building process?
I guess I would just add on to agree with you. In Canada, we had a horrifying legacy of something called residential schools, where we took Indigenous populations and we forcibly removed children from their families, sent them thousands of miles away to go to a school where this is literally in the documents to breed the Indian out of them. And one of the first things that they did is change their names, and then they changed their diets. And that was a way of erasing culture, disconnecting community, disconnecting identity. And that was a top-down substitution of one cultural institution for another for purposes of power and exploitation. And so I think you're exactly right, is it is a political act, and it can be intentionally resistant or it can be intentionally forceful. But you take those things and you do those to other human beings, or human beings do those to the recipes that they engage with.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Brilliant presentations and really thought-provoking, and I'm really glad that we start the workshop with this panel, actually. So I'm going to pick up on Daniel's comment and then link it to Sasha's, actually, one of the phrases that you said. So you're interested in recipes that are not cooked, right? So recipes that do not lead to cooking. But to keep recipe alive, you must repeat it. So on the one hand, you can think about that as the using up of ingredients where ingredients are not, recipes that are not cooked. But in our project that we're thinking, we know that there's a lot of recipes that exist, and in a way we're kind of not restoring it, but trying to recover and collect it and creating these sort of databases. or a list. So what, in that impulse of collecting those recipes, what is the impulse behind it? Because I don't think that we're interested in these recipes because we're going to make again turtle soup in whatever version that has, just to use your example. And it's not quite that the action of thinking about the recipe and trying to find substitutions either. So I'm trying to understand what sort of, for example, in our consortium we're interested in all of these history and heritage and so on, but as recipes that are no longer cooked or prepared or replicate, reproduce, whatever, what are we seeking, or what kind of knowledge or practice are we trying to either develop, produce, articulate, or create knowledge from, or even value, right, in a place like this? So thank you. I welcome some thoughts.
You want to go first, Dan?
Oh, no, I would love for you to go first. Michelle. That was a tough question.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you, Rosie. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit too is also what is the relationship between a dish and a recipe, and what is a recipe when we use that term. And there's some brilliant papers that are also thinking about oral transmissions of recipes. So is the recipe kind of the words? Is it then the written down text? Is it the instructions? Or is it the fluency and being able to kind of create this final dish? And so the more that I think about this, the more I wonder about these relationships. And obviously thinking about recipe development, which I should probably confess that I dabbled in at some point. But, you know, this idea that you have many, many different recipes for one dish, and of course that one dish is not going to be the same, there's variations, but you'll have kind of a standard name for a dish and way more recipes for it. So in terms of the value of them and collecting them and what kind of knowledge they share or what kind of knowledge they preserve, I think it's interesting in terms of where dates come in and how we understand the age of a recipe, and that's where having the paratext of kind of a cookbook or a publication is very useful, because in part because they're written in this internal present tense and they're future oriented. Even if we're not going to be cooking them, there's always that kind of what if potential that I think adds something to them, which is a little bit different than collecting other historical sources. And so they never feel completely static in that sense, because there's always kind of that potential.
Yeah, I love that. That's really great. That makes a ton of sense to me. So what she said. No, I mean, so Jeff and I were sitting in a bar.
Which time?
This isn't often. All of our answers should begin. So Jeff and I were sitting in a bar and trying to figure out this aura question, right? And do recipes actually have aura? And we got in a discussion about whether it's the recipe that's the heritage, or the dish that's the heritage, or the memory of the recipe that's the or the cookbook, and we didn't come up with an answer. And then we paid and went home. And we still don't have an answer to this oral question. And I don't really know what to do with that, but I think that in some ways I think you're asking, your question gets at that confusion, right? And I think we both agree that, you know, an artwork has aura. The thing about the recipe is it doesn't really, it exists, as I think Sasha was saying, in these really fascinating temporal states of it invites production, even as it forecloses production. It's the rotted bits, right? After the food has gone, you're left with the recipe, which promises that it can be made again, which raises this question of value. And I suppose that part of the value, the importance, of substitution, and in valorizing substitution is that maybe it gives us an opportunity for heritage without value, or at least heritage without economic value. And that's sort of where I kind of like that idea, right, of a heritage that you do not sit back and admire, but a heritage that you argue with, a heritage that you're invited to reject, a heritage that you can, either feel part of, or it invites a conversation about the pliable limits of belonging.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to jump in and ask a question myself. It's just so many, marvelous ideas are popping up as you guys are speaking. And I have a question for all of you, actually, because the way that I'm interpreting Rosie's question also, and that one that I think all of your presentations bring up is, what is the original, right? What is the original, Sasha has suggested, it's the turtle soup that originally Nicaraguan natives were cooking. Is that the original? Is it the recipe? I mean, is it the oral version? That all came to me as I was, is it the first place it's made? Is it the first place it's printed? Is it, so what is, when we say you're talking about substitution, so that begs the question, what is the original anyway? And I would like to have Dan and Jeff sort of think through more, or I just want to push back. I think it's a very provocative and interesting, to bring Benjamin into this. And it's been a long, long time since I've read the essay, so forgive me. But when you say recipe as a form of capitalist impulse, I mean, there's so many ways in which I think, yeah, okay, and being a modernist, you can see those things. But for anyone who does pre-modern, what about before that, right? Can you be more precise about what exactly is happening to the recipe in that moment, besides just more precise measurement, which there is in pre-modern times also some precise measurements. Like, what exactly is happening, right? Because we can understand what he's talking about with artwork, but as you point out, it doesn't exactly fit. So I'd like some more precision or more thinking through out loud about what is happening in that particular moment. And then for Sasha, as you were speaking about Samin Nosrat's book, I immediately thought, I hadn't really thought about that, but one of the things that recipes, the emotional things that it brings is the sense, if you don't know how to cook, a sense of comfort or security. If I follow this, then I can, so the idea of what does and at the same time, I'm thinking, when I leaf through cookbooks, I'm thinking, can I make this or not? And, that's too hard. It stretches my time, so I really love the idea of thinking through what kinds of emotional or, different states are called out, just even in the reading of the recipe and what that anticipation of it might be. So the temporal element, I love thinking through that part. So those are my very unformed, but just what your presentations and papers called forth to me. So any thoughts on any of that?
I'll dive in.
Yeah,
sure.
Jeff,
so just thinking about this idea of what is this capitalist impulse. This is Columbian Exchange because that's what came to my head first. Is that those food items made their way from Mesoamerica into Europe. And they got there once, cool, but to get there over and over again required an infrastructure of shipbuilding and eventually railways, of ports, of sailors, of literacy, of all of these things that needed to be developed, but also sustained over time. And to do that, you need people to want the things that you are going to sail 7,000 miles to bring back. And a recipe is a way of doing that, of putting an idea into a person's head that if you can get these ingredients, you can make this thing that is wonderful. And so part of what we're trying to put forward is that the recipe is not neutral. Like, as Dan said, you have to acquire these things. And that acquiring is not neutral. There's this infrastructure. There's this profit-seeking motive of shareholders and corporations and companies with, rights to do whatever they please around the globe. And I think that's what we're trying to get at is you don't just see a recipe and the ingredients are there. There's a whole economy behind it that needs you to do this thing so that they can keep doing their thing. And yeah.
Yeah, to me, I love that. And thank you so much for the questions. I really feel like I'm sitting, this is such an exciting moment for me because I'm sitting with like, honestly, academic heroes of mine. So it's both intimidating and super exciting. To me, it comes down a lot to that picture in Fanny Farmer of the nature malt transformed into the measuring cups. And I think that to me, there's a fracturing in the history of recipes, and we shouldn't think about it in some long literary line where we're thinking about from poetry is, I don't know whether literary scholars would similarly see a fracturing and say the poetic form. But there are recipes there are multiple recipe forms, of course. And I think that Sasmin's Nusrat's comments get to that. And in many ways, I think that we're trying to think about the particular one and one that really is ingrained in that history of measurement. And that Fanny Farmer takes the nature malt, the picture of nature, itself disciplined, and removing the ingredients and leaving the measurements is the act here. And part of what I think we're trying to do is to think about not just Benjamin as it relates to cooking, but also to ecology, right? Insofar as is that I think that most of us in this room would probably have some discomfort now with the possibilities of mechanical reproduction. And that's where I think that there is a politics in the idea that a recipe is going to look different time after time after time. There's a politics in that can be amplified.
This is a really exciting conversation, so I'm going to try to focus. I finally saw Angeles Nuevos this summer after trying to see it for 15 years, which was really important in terms of Benjamin's thesis of history and also thinking, I went many places to try to see it, but I was curious about this too in terms of the aura and the question of the original. And forgive me if this is a bit of a cop-out, but I am wondering a little bit, can there be an original when something is supposed to repeat? You know, what role does repetition play in that? So the other thing that I was thinking about is I think in food studies we have a pretty good vocabulary around cookbooks when it comes to genres. So thinking about, we have the professional chef cookbook, which is often very aspirational and very difficult to do anything with. We have the more user-friendly home cookbook. We have the community cookbook, which historians we all love because we know somebody actually made those recipes at least once, hopefully more times. But I was wondering, you know, how does this kind of filter in terms of categories of recipes as well? So obviously the cookbook is the larger frame. We can think about it in relation to the paratext, but also, you know, some of the papers that we're looking at earlier examples, it's really interesting this difference between the recipe as instruction, as hand-holding, as this kind of railing to teach you how to cook, and then examples of early recipes that had more of a professional audience that assumed you knew all of this, and so it's not teaching you how to cook. You already have to have that knowledge, which I think is quite interesting, again, in terms of this larger question of what knowledge do recipes share and how.
Lisa Smith.
Thank you. Great set of papers. I really enjoyed them. So I'm trying to think of how to form my thoughts because, as you said, this is a great conversation, so bear with me. So first of all, I was thinking a bit about the point of this fracture in the history of recipes. because what happens with the modern period is so very different from the pre-modern period. And so in the manuscript recipe books that I often study, you've got lots of seasonality in it. You've got, and in the printed books of the 18th century, you've got lots of description too on, you buy this at this particular season, this is when you should get it. And so there's lots of detail there, which suggests that they're not even 100% sure about the seasonality and practice in the printed books. So I guess I was wondering if you might say a bit more about what you see as the big change and why does it suddenly become this process of standardization in such a big way? And I just wanted to note too that I find it interesting that you're doing the taxonomy, which is also a process of standardization, if you could speak to that. And then on the turtle soup, I want to give you an even darker reading than that. So you take this turtle soup recipe, and there were written accounts of people eating turtle soup in both the Caribbean and the West Indies, and none of them are as graphic as Hannah Glass's recipe. Now, to get that turtle over to England, you would have had to have taken it, across the sea to get it there in the first place. So it's not surprising that there maybe wasn't a turtle in London for the one alderman dinner. But so why is her recipe so graphic, especially when she's writing for basically a middle-class audience, and it's not people who would ever eat that turtle. So within that space, what kind of really dark reading could you give it? And especially when it then gets distilled into the mock turtle recipe. Go dark.
Who wants to go first? Or at the same time? Well, let me just, because Sasha's writing smart things. Let me just give you just a real quick points, because I know there's a bunch of other questions, and I think it's a great point, and I'm not going to go too far into this notion of how we should think about genres, because I don't necessarily do history terribly well, and I certainly don't do literature very well. But I do think that, just because Shakespeare called it a play and Eugene O'Neill called it a play, does that mean we should assume that it's the same genre? Should we think in terms of stops and starts and changing aesthetic values? And that's really when there's an aesthetic value in the idea that a recipe should be same tomorrow, the next day the same, and so on and so forth. If you go into a restaurant and you order spaghetti carbonara, you kind of want it to look like the one on the table next to you. That's the aesthetics of it. But as Benjamin would remind us, aesthetics can never be removed from political economy, right? And that there is an emerging value attached to, Rossi's point, an emerging value attached to repeatability. And that can't be separated from the imperative of reproducibility, right? Like, you need the gun, one part of a gun, to be connected to another part of a gun made someplace else. Like, that's the need for mechanical reproduction. You can't have a train going over a steel rail that's different from the one next to it. And I don't think that we can separate them, and that's the whole point of Mackenzie's. We can't separate that desire for reproducibility in steel from that in pastry. And that's, we can see that in all kinds of different artistic forms, from architecture to film and the like, which, it could be that, in fact, aura isn't the point. It's the aesthetics of reproduction. So, I don't know. We'll talk about that over beer.
That sounds good.
Or wine.
Yeah, so they were shipping thousands and thousands of turtles annually, and so it was about how that number kind of piled up in terms of the turtles themselves not being able to keep up with the demand, which I think in many ways is already a dark story, but also very important in terms of thinking about what we can call culinary extinction, or how appetites transform environments, where it's often things that people prize, things that people like to eat, things that are important. We can think about that with contemporary monocultures too. And so the idea that something actually matters, we can lose that. We can make it go extinct. In terms of that, that's like the whole dark environmental reading that I could give it. But I do want to add one other point about recipes, which I think is interesting, that comes back to knowledge, where, you know, even if somebody, just thinking about a different form of literacy, but even if somebody is then not making that recipe, what is gained from reading it, right? And then how that translates, especially with the history of turtle soup, which was so much about class and obviously mobility, and that changed over time. But so even being like, oh, I know how to make that, I understand what that is, I think is also a valuable point of access that recipes can provide.
Multiple reproductions.
Yeah.
From the very back of the room.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the most obnoxious kind of question, but I think an obligatory one at any conference, which is, why did you engage with this literature and not this other literature? But I'll be the one to get that out of the way. I'm going to return to this point of the aura that has already been raised a number of times. And I think we share both an appreciation and an affection for Benjamin. And so I wondered, as you were speaking and as you were talking about the differences between art and craft and the distance we take from seasonality and so forth, which is, of course, this moment of the incapturable transient moment. Why art in the age of mechanical reproduction and not the storyteller? Because it feels that what you're describing here is the trace, the fingerprint of the potter on the clay. And Sasha, you made the great point about what is the original for something that's meant to be repeated. What is the clue, to bring in somebody else entirely? What is the Ginsbergian clue that takes us to the moment that is itself trying to repeat a transient, this is for repetition? And so I guess my question is, why stick with aura? What is aura giving you that you feel needs to be preserved here? I think I should stop talking at this point.
I think it's just what attracted me to the idea is that there is this, you look at a recipe for a spaghetti carbonara, and it alludes to this idea of unoriginal, even if there isn't one. It alludes to this idea that there is an original, and that it is reproducible. That, I, living in North America, can get a recipe for a food from thousands of miles away, and with the proper accumulation of ingredients, that I can reproduce this and experience something that would otherwise require me to travel. And so that idea that there is this unoriginal originality is kind of where I'm seeing the aura lying, and we just wanted to kind of pick away at that of when you're endlessly substituting on and riffing on this thing that is presented as a named entity, what does that do to everything down the chain from that?
Yeah, and I think the aura is a really, really tough question. And ultimately, it may lead us down the road to say, Benjamin isn't useful for thinking about the aesthetics of reproductions in an ecological or capitalist sense, and that's entirely plausible. We'll see where the revisions go, but I do think that there's a heritage question here as it relates to this particular relish project, in that if we're talking about heritage, where heritage has often lived as a culture industry has been in the art and architecture and the visual and sonic, visual primarily arts and sonic arts. And so raising this question of what is the relationship, artistic relationship within capitalism of the culinary arts is it maybe useful in understanding what we mean in our contribution to cultural heritage.
Regina Sexton.
Thank you, Jeff, Sasha, and Ben. It was brilliant. But I kind of want to double back to Rosie's question, because I suppose Rosie was going to the heart of the Relish project in bringing out this word into this forum of heritage. And I think that's really interesting. And it's also a bit comforting to exist in this state of discomfort this morning, because it's really great that all of these sticky questions are coming out, I think, because this is the purpose of the workshop. And I think I thought, Sasha, your example of the turtle soup, the mock turtle soup and the mock turtle soup, was actually really interesting, because that did bring it back for me to heritage, because I think heritage in Rosie's question concerned things like time. It was a location one, so how do you locate time, how do you locate value, and how do you locate all of those things as you go into the future with an application? And I thought your turtle, mock, and mock was actually heritage in action. Probably what we didn't hear was what happens next. And we want, I think, to finish that a little bit and to draw it out. I think it would be really great to hear more about your ideas behind that and the values that you assign to the mock turtle soup. Which brings us back to the question of definitions. Heritage is not history, and history is kind of heritage. So we need to think about the heritization of things, particularly here in this context of recipes. And that brings me back to the other thing that came out from your talk, Dan and Jeff, is this great kind of accumulation of language, taxonomy, and a lexicon. And you started that by doing a really good thing, and I love the simplicity of statements, because I've been talking about that myself as well. Recipe is an ecological act. We've then heard that a recipe is a political act. And I also wondered if you got the inspiration from that from Wendell Berry, that eating is an agricultural act. So it also might be useful for us to think about, it's like that cartoon, Love Is. Do you remember those? Recipe is. You know, so I'm just interested in those finishes as well, perhaps.
Honestly, I got that inspiration from a conversation with Sasha 2 weeks ago. So that's
yeah. So yes, it is in dialogue with Wendell Berry. And so when I started thinking about how eating is an ecological act, it was because I was doing a Blue Humanities postdoctoral fellowship at Ca' Foscari University in Venice. And you know, the whole point of Blue Humanities is really to think about the role that water plays, right? And eating is a lot more than agricultural. And so framing it as ecological, I thought, gave it a little bit more space. Fantastic questions. I'm really excited to think about this more also with what happens next, because I'm also interested in terms of heritage and balancing kind of quote unquote positive heritage with negative heritage, and what that value does, or different types of heritage we inherit but also choose to remember. And I think what's interesting for me in terms of this question of what happens next and the mock turtle soup is once again an example of how something was on so many menus. And when I was doing research before on the history of Indigenous restaurants in Canada, I noticed that there were turtle soups on lots of menus that had nothing to do with what I was studying, but I kept seeing it, and then it's gone, right? And so this question about, you know, how do recipes help us remember things, but also turtle soup in many ways is kind of a warning story. So thinking about, you know, the relationship heritage has with the present, but also actively creating the future.
Too, right? I mean, part of you know, just thinking about this notion and in hearing these two papers together is this notion of reproductions, and really asking a fundamental question about whether the idea of democratization of art, in specifically food and cooking, like if more people can eat turtle soup or spaghetti carbonara, or is that also a using up, right? And how you imagine democratization without in an ecological sense.
Lucy Long, for what might be the last question of the session, unless the question is very...
I'll try to keep this short. So I want to challenge Jeff and Dan. I think recipe as a capitalist impulse we're talking about the printed recipe.
100% agree.
Yes, and if we look at oral tradition and imitative tradition, we find so many different uses of the recipe, so many different ways of reproducing. So that also gets into the idea of genres, because when we talk about mechanical reproduction, if you're talking about music, it means playing without feeling. However, the ways in which feeling is expressed differs with each genre. So, so we have all these different layers that we have to bring in there. So, and I keep thinking about how in Indiana, turtle is still harvested and used in soups. And that's usually not in recipes because there are laws against it. So.
Want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah. No, I think we absolutely agree with you. I mean, what we set to talk about up here was this idea of the printed recipe, and moving on from that, the daily idea of you open up a news source or a social media feed, and it is daily, hourly, minutely recipes being thrown at you over and over again. You can go to a large language model and say, give me a recipe for this, and it may or may not tell you to add rocks to it. Like it's this multiplication of things, and there is a tradition that both precedes what we're talking about and leads up to what we're talking about and exists in parallel with what we're talking about. But we were trying to think through this idea of what does it mean to have ever more recipes that demand ever more ingredients, that demand ever more innovation isn't quite the right word, but ever more shifting of what the recipe contains ad infinitum. And so you're exactly right, and all of those things exist.
So I totally agree with you, Lucy, but one of the things is how can we, humanities people always we just pluralize, right? Like instead of saying, well, we're going to talk about the recipe, we're going to talk about recipes, right? And to resist that, the one thing I think that does hold these genres together is the notion of ecology. And this is where the environmental humanities or the socialist environmental, whatever term you want to use, is there really is, whatever the recipe is, there is an ecological impulse there, positive or negative.
I agree.
Okay, let me see what we're doing. No, it's okay. Okay, thank you. We had a question from Diana McKenzie and also people in the back, but I gotta pass the microphone to her chair for closing.
I just think this has been a fantastic panel. So many great ideas to open up the conversation over lunch. So many wonderful sort of things percolating in my head. So please join me in thanking all the panelists for a wonderful session.
Thank you, Michelle.
Being on a panel with you both is